thank you for coming. I'm Mark Torres. I'm here to talk about my book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance, released January 21st this year. It feels like it's such a long ride already, but we've been doing a lot of presentations. So, eugenics has been written about by other authors and historians, but never from the local perspective. Now, the global headquarters of this whole, everything you're going to learn today took place at Cold Spring Harbor, 30 miles from where we sit. And that made a telling of this history from the local perspective all the more important and necessary. I couldn't do any of my work without research. If I can't write about it and show it and teach it, I have to learn first. So it took a lot of research to understand this topic. It took me places to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Archives, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Truman State University in Missouri, and many other locations. And I looked at many thousands of documents, photographs, articles, personal correspondence, a lot of boring, bland stuff, but really to understand the whole picture was important. So everywhere I go, I say, have you ever heard of eugenics? People say yes, no. And if anyone ever got a consensus, there is no true answer. It's a target that's elusive to answer. But originally, the concept kind of reintroduced itself in the 19th century. It was based on a theory that the best traits in humans can be engineered, like breeding racehorses or flowers. It's not new. The idea, the quest to improve humanity is mentioned in ancient Greek, Roman, and Sanskrit texts, but it generally resurfaced in the 19th century in England with these ideas. Among the founding fathers, Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, he's known as the founding father of eugenics. He actually named the word eugenics, which generally means well-born. He was an English scientist who developed the first weather maps, the use of fingerprints for forensic criminology. And Galton was the kind of guy who was obsessed with patterns and statistics. His slogan was, wherever you can, count. He was obsessed with counting everything. Two other names you should know in the founding fathers. One of them is Thomas Malthus, an English economist who argued for strict population control, meaning the planet's only so big, so only so many people can live on it at one time. And Johann Gregor Mendel, an Austrian biologist who experimented with the hereditary traits of pea plants. And these were kind of the background founding fathers of this new science that was burgeoning in the early 20th century. So, again, what is eugenics? There's generally two strains. The positive eugenics is the positive theory. Human beings can be a perfect race through proper and selective breeding. Meaning, wouldn't it be great if children can be born without sickness, illness? We would all say yes. As parents, even if you're not a parent, we would all want to champion that goal. But of course, it was purely aspirational and not attainable. The negative eugenics, this is largely what took over in this history, was the idea to prevent those with so-called bad traits from having children and ultimately eliminate them. This included the poor, the mentally and physically disabled, and the morally undesirable citizens, the people they didn't want, really. And to quote historian Nathaniel Comfort, the problem with utopias is that they establish a set of aspirations that then blind you to a certain set of consequences, and that can be dangerous. Now, it's been a while since we had this scientific method of research, and I'm not a scientist. But generally, scientists get this theory in their heads. They test out that theory. They ask questions, take experiments to either prove it.
Do you think we need to have the light off?
You can put it on.
Do you think it?
You can put it on. It's a small group. As long as you all consent, have it on.
Okay.
Yeah. So scientists, they have this theory, they test it, they either prove or disprove. Simple stuff, right? Eugenicists practice this in reverse. They had their theory, largely based on race and class, and they just wanted to get the data to support it. So they basically practiced it in reverse. For instance, if you had a married couple, if the husband was a thief and the wife was prone to alcoholism, eugenicists would automatically theorize that they have bad genes and that their kids would automatically get those genes, totally discounting the socioeconomic factors that led to the husband being a thief and the wife being alcoholic. But this is how they thought back at this time of year, at this time of history. So today, we use words like moron, idiot, imbecile as general insults. 100 years ago, they were legitimate medical diagnoses. And you see the scale there, from the lowest to the highest, is how they saw people, right? And collectively, a lot of these were referred to as feeble-minded, right? It was a catch-all diagnosis that combined mental deficiency with immorality. And it was dangerous because anybody could fall into that group and be marginalized and labeled and then dealt with through eugenic measures. Now, when you hear of eugenics, and you talk about ancient Rome and the UK, make no mistake, eugenics was made in America, largely by this one man, Charles Benedict Davenport. He's a true architect. He was born in Connecticut, lived on Long Island, and died on Long Island. A Harvard-educated biologist and teacher. He was no slouch. He was the leading biologist in an era that gave humanity advancements, phenomenal advancements in biology. Really sharp, brilliant mind of scientists of the era. Now, Davenport was influenced by Mendel's work on the pea plants and Galton's statistical mind, his counting mind. His goal was to prove that heredity worked the same way in humans as it did in animals and plants. He described eugenics as the science of human improvement by better breeding. He believed the U.S. was destined to be a master race. We've heard these terms before, right? And he argued that eugenics was the only way to achieve that goal. In 1902, him and his wife went to England to meet Francis Galton. And the purpose of that meeting was to get his endorsement. And he got it through a letter saying, Davenport's the guy to lead this mission here in America. And that really gave Davenport a lot of stature to go forward. Harry Laughlin, born in Iowa and Princeton, educated biologist. He served as superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office from 1910 to 1939, the entire time the building was open. He worked with U.S. Congress to pass strict immigration laws in the name of eugenics, and he developed a blueprint for eugenic sterilization across the United States. Henry Goddard, born in Maine, a mathematician and psychologist, he was the director of the New Jersey Training School for Feeble-Minded Children at Vineland, New Jersey. It was him, along with Davenport, who devised that term, feeble-minded, again, that catch-all diagnosis. He also developed a standardized version of the IQ test. And this test was used widely by eugenicists throughout the world. Now, in fact, in May of 1917, and this Goddard's IQ test was given to 1.7 million Army recruits here in the U.S. They went to Fort Lee, all the bases in the U.S. And based on their findings, more than half of the U.S. military was declared morons. Now, typically people laugh at that, but I credit you guys for not. And it was interesting because that was, again, a legitimate medical diagnosis. So what eugenicists would do is fearmonger and say, we're in trouble. Our military's falling. We're so inferior. We're in trouble. And this really shot. It gave a lot more credibility to the science of eugenics. But in reality, this IQ test it had vague and biased questions. Now, many of these soldiers were farm boys upstate and all around the country. They never really had proper schooling.
What year were you?
1917. Right, it's right after World War I, or really towards the end of World War I. And many of these soldiers were raised in poor rural areas, never had school, and they would ask questions about fine art and technological questions about cars. Of course, they didn't know the answers. When they got them wrong, their intelligence was reflected to show that it showed their level of, quote, intelligence. Mary Harriman, we all know Harriman State Park, upstate, came from her and her husband. Born in Rochester, New York, the widow of E.H. Harriman, a really rich, wealthy railway mogul. Upon his death, she inherited $100 million. Today's money, that's $3.7 billion. Staggering wealth. She was also a staunch eugenicist, a very close ally and friend with Charles Davenport, and she bought 80 acres of land at Cold Spring Harbor, which I can't imagine what that would cost today. And they also paid for the construction of what would be the Eugenics Record Office. And the Carnegie Institute, established in D.C., Washington in 1902 to encourage investigation, research, and discovery. The Carnegie Institute provided enormous resources for the eugenics both here in America and later in Nazi Germany. Now, if you put all these kind of relationships together with Davenport meeting Galton in England to get the endorsement, Harry Laughlin to assist with the program, Henry Goddard to help expand eugenic diagnoses, funding from the Harrimans, Rockefellers, and Carnegie Institute and others, at that point the American Eugenics Program was launched. Now, if you remember nothing else from today, understand that eugenics was not a fringe, small, marginalized movement. It was what I call the rage of the age. It was taught in almost 300 colleges in the United States, including Yale, Harvard, all the Ivy League schools. It was fully embraced by the medical, by doctors and scientists. It was openly supported by every president from Theodore Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover. Even religion, aside from the Catholic religion, a lot of religions endorsed eugenics. They had sermon contests and eugenic essay contests. There were many books written on the topic, popular culture, movies, commercial advertisements. And also, eugenics had the ability to run along with other movements, birth control, vision, all these social welfare programs. And some prominent Americans who were eugenicists included Alexander Graham Bell, W. E. Du Bois, and Helen Keller, which you'll find how surprising that really is shortly. Margaret Sanger, the leader of the American birth control movement. She had written many books, a lot of them really extremely racist if you read the books, including The Pivot of Civilization. Sanger was also a eugenicist, but interesting though in her case was she believed, like Malthus, that you should sterilize everyone. The rich, poor, it didn't matter to her. The eugenicists said, hold the horses. We don't mind the poor, the marginalized people, let's sterilize them, but the rich, hands off, leave them alone. And that kind of kept her a little bit marginalized from the group, but nevertheless, she was a part of the, as many other groups at the time, ran along the lines with eugenics. The Black Stork, a popular eugenic propaganda film released in 1917. It features a doctor who counsels the couple to not have a child because it would likely be eugenically defective. This film played in theaters for 10 straight years. And it's a silent film, of course, and you can probably just see it on YouTube if you wish. It was that popular and powerful. Nationally, there were many events. The Panama Pacific International Expo, the World's Fair of the time, San Francisco, 1915. This exhibit, the eugenic exhibit there, was visited by 18 million people in 9 months. And in the Midwest, they had fitter family contests and health exhibits where there were fierce competitions for the fittest families. People would dress up, they had the children, they'd all vie for the best award, the fittest family. Huge competitions. And they had this in the Midwest for one specific reason. It's where they had farming, agriculture, cattle, horsing. They wanted to kind of synonymize that lifestyle with eugenics so that it would be an easier fit. Now, if you go back to the beginnings, here we are, as you see in the cover as well, Cold Spring Harbor on the North Shore of Long Island. It's a former whaling port, lush with flora and fauna for scientific research. 1890, the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Science opened a state-of-the-art biological lab at these grounds to study birds, plants, insects, and whatnot. 1898, Charles Davenport was appointed as the director. In 1904, the Carnegie Institute leased a 10-acre tract of land, and they opened what became known as the Carnegie Station for Experimental Evolution. And Davenport was appointed director for the whole program. This is what kind of he led. And he made no surprises of what his intentions were at a press release. He announced, quote, "The problem of the origin of species has taken quite a new form in the half-century since Darwin's epoch-making work appeared. The work of the station is not therefore to confirm Darwin, but to go much farther than Darwin did." Here is a picture of the Eugenics Record Office, opened in 1910 under Davenport with lucrative funding from Mary Harriman. It was in operation just under 30 years, but this served as the headquarters of the eugenics program. Now, you look at it, it doesn't look like much, two-story, administrative-looking building. I will tell you, even as I wrote the book, I assumed this building was destroyed. It's not. It's still around. It's a private home. I wouldn't want to knock on the door, or maybe I'll put a book in the mailbox for him, but someone does live there in a beautiful area still by Cold Spring Harbor, but this has a really dark history to it for what they did. In essence, the ERO, the Eugenics Record Office, the ERO, served as a data collection point. They stored millions of index cards, family charts, pedigree charts in special fireproof cabinets, state-of-the-art for its time. Now it kind of looks archaic, but at the time it was state-of-the-art stuff. And the information used was to support the science and amplify the movement. The ERO also published a publication called Eugenical News, sort of like the Twitter of the time. They would get all this eugenic information from around the world, put it in a magazine or pamphlet, and send it back out to the masses to get wide distribution. Now, the ERO developed a training program for eugenic field workers who were mostly female, college-educated field workers. Between 1911 and 1924, an estimated 250 field workers were hired. They were paid $75 a month to work a minimum of 1 year in the field. They traveled the country with these biased questionnaires to interview families, patients, prisoners, and all aimed at labeling, much like the IQ test, of the people who were questioned. It was aimed to label them socially defective. All the records of them were stored back at the ERO. Why do they do all this? Well, we know because the records tell us. Beginning in July of 1911, members of the eugenics section of the American Breeders Association began having meetings at the City Club in Manhattan and 45th Street. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, many prominent doctors, scientists, leading thinkers of the time, all attended these meetings. It was really a big to-do, and they had a series of meetings for several years. Finally, in 1914, they actually reduced into writing what their intentions were. They drafted a report authored by Harry Laughlin, And they discussed the ways to deal with the 10% of the U.S. population, 15 million Americans. They call them the submerged 10, the submerged 10%. And they said, how are we going to deal with these folks who are socially defective? They had a 10-part plan that included life segregation, locking people up in mental institutions during their breeding years, marriage restriction laws, forced sterilization, and even mass murder. They contemplated killing up to 15 million Americans by 1914, all in the name of eugenics. Now, you may wonder, who are these groups? Well, they itemized 10 groups. The first one, the feeble-minded, which could really be anyone under the sun. 2 is the poor. 3, alcoholics. 4, criminals of any kind. 5, epileptics. 6, the insane. 7, the physically weak class. 8, those prone to specific diseases. 9, the deformed. And 10, those with defective sensory organs, the blind, deaf, and mute. Which makes it surprising that Helen Keller was a eugenicist. She clearly was one of these within that group. So now they're plan in place, and they went to all of these facilities, and what I say, they was really going on the hunt for the data on these people. Mental asylums, prisons, poorhouses, Native American tribal lands, poor rural areas upstate particularly, and even Coney Island, the sideshow, the so-called freak shows. They spend a lot of time. And they were able to get to these facilities for several reasons. Davenport was a renowned scientist. He had a lot of clout. Wherever he went, they catered to him. In fact, one time he called up the Museum of Natural History to ask for 2 skulls of Shinnecock Indians that they had in their archives. He said, sure, we'll send them right over. So he had a lot of clout. And also, many of the people who ran these facilities were also eugenicists. They were more than eager to help and kind of get, and this is all the age of before HIPAA, the HIPAA privacy laws. So, you know, it was really a free reign at this point to go through. Some of the facilities, you see Pilgrim State on the top, on the bottom, the State Custodial Institution in Rome, New York, where most of the eugenical sterilizations in New York occurred between 1912 and 1920. Kings Park. On the shores of Long Island Sound, it operated from 1885 to 1993, over 150 buildings at its peak. Its self-sufficient facility had its own livestock, fire station, power plant, maintenance buildings, its own railroad station. And eugenicists, as with other places, were given free reign, and they would spend months here, you know, studying the patients, studying the records, and gathering all of this data for their reasons. Coney Island. You know, you've seen, you know, the freak shows, the so-called freak shows. Many of these people, of course, were exploited, but also many of them really lived a lucrative lifestyle. They were intelligent, they were smart, they knew what they were doing, they played the game, the system as well. Up on the right, Lionel, half man, half lion. In reality, he had a condition called hypertrichosis, a condition which produced excessive facial and body hair. Made him look like that. They billed him as the half man, half lion. And on the left, Tony, the alligator skin boy. He had ichthyosis, a condition which leaves tough rectangular scales on the skin, making him look as he did. Eugenicists would pounce on these shows and say, if we don't do anything, we're all going to wind up like them. And this was an age where there was little information, so people really feared these kind of talks and information. Letchworth Village is up in Rockland County. The remains are still there. I was there not too long ago. Kind of what was a beautiful facility, but really dark history. From 1911 to 1996, Charles Davenport spent a lot of time at this facility. In August of 1929, him and 2 other doctors castrated a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome. They wanted to study the tissues for eugenic studies. The tests were, of course, inconclusive. Now, the boy's mother was also at the facility, and she was also badly disabled. So it begs the question, did they really have proper consent to do this? I would say no, but there's no records to support that they did have the consent to do this. You know, many of these pedigree charts, they showed the good ones, what they believe were the good ones, the near kin of Theodore Roosevelt, you know, the positive traits that we should all shoot for. This is the ideal family. And they would use this data to influence all this information. And then they would show the negative side. And I would actually pay special attention to this slide here on the left. 4 generations in one almshouse at one time in Yaphank, New York, July 1917. 4 people there. This woman's holding a 2-week-old child. It says on the bottom, a borderline family in which illegitimacy runs high and not quite able to care for itself in organized society. In reality, they were poor. They were poverty-stricken, and they had no place to go but a place like that. And when the eugenicists come, they're going to label them as that. On the right, the hereditary predisposition to mental illness. All of these reports and charts to kind of, again, build influence on it, as well as gadgets and devices. Right on the left, they had this abacus that was supposed to show the structure of human chromosomes. And on the right, this fancy gadget was what was known as the mechanism of Mendelian heredity. It's supposed to show how chromosomes carry gene traits. Again, pomp and circumstance to really build it up. Here was a report by the ERO in 1920 called Crime and Race Descent. It was meant to show the racial profile of U.S. prisoners in comparison to other prisoners in other countries. Now, the big goal for the eugenicists was national policy, right? If their science is going to take off, the country had to adopt this. One of the early things they passed was marriage restriction laws. Several states had these laws that prevented people with physical or mental disabilities from getting married. Think about that for a second. And the laws encouraged others to report their fellow citizens. In Virginia, 1924, the Racial Integrity Act was passed. It was led by a staunch eugenicist named Walter Plecker. That law prohibited the marriage of any white person to another person with even, quote, 1 drop of non-Caucasian blood. Violators faced fines, imprisonment, and nullified marriages. Eugenicists hailed this as a huge step, but still not enough. They continued to need more. So immigration restriction was also one of the big things, right? Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants came to the U.S., 8 million alone, between 1900 and 1909. Harry Laughlin was enlisted by Congress to make several eugenic presentations, all based on racist and xenophobia. And it helped pass the Emergency Restriction Act of 1921. That cut immigration by Southern and Eastern Europe by nearly 2/3. 3 years later, they influenced Congress to pass the Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted access by many European countries to as low as 3%. They basically shut the border down during a time that was building up to in between the world wars, and we know what happened after that. Now, the anti-immigration movement was led by one man largely, a man named Madison Grant. He was a lawyer, author, conservationist, and zoologist. He helped found the Bronx Zoo. He helped save the redwood trees in California. He was also a notorious racist. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. He believed that whites were the master race facing extinction, and he openly criticized and complained about all races entering the U.S., Jews, Italians, Poles, Irish, etc. Hitler read this book when he was in prison, and he called it, quote, his Bible. He created a term called the Nordic race. Much later, the Nazis would call it the Aryan race, this fictionalized version of the best version of the white race. Grant was a staunch eugenicist and closely aligned with the ERO, and in 1920, Charles Davenport wrote a letter to Madison Grant stating the following: "Can we build a wall high enough around this country to keep out these cheaper races?" 1920. Now, one of the most effective ways, if the eugenicists is really going to take this off, was sterilization. Do not let these people that they feel are defective have children. So they believed it was the surest, fastest, cheapest way to do it. As of January 1921, there were just over 3,000 sterilizations performed in 15 U.S. states, led largely by California, Nebraska, Oregon, Indiana, Wisconsin, and New York. But of course, for eugenicists, this was too slow. They needed to speed up the process. In 1922, Harry Laughlin wrote a book entitled Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. It really was a model sterilization law for other states to look at, copy, and then push through to pass in their own state. Kind of like a guide, if you will. But a lot of these laws were still being struck down by the Supreme Court. They were unconstitutional.
Why was the number so high in California?
California was by far the highest, and as I go a little further, at all times they were always the highest eugenical sterilization states. It's surprising, right? It almost seems kind of counterintuitive, but they've had that dubious history being there.
So the testing that they did to determine how whatever wrong you were was higher in California. They were stricter with the results.
But not so much the testing. Remember also the size of the state. California's huge. It's a border state with Mexico.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of factors there. Of course, it's one of the largest states, like Indiana. Of course, it'll be less per capita than California. So size does play a lot of factor in here. But there were many leading eugenicists on the West Coast who really pushed eugenics as well. So again, but the Supreme Court was striking these cases down. It was unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment. So they needed a test case. They needed someone to get in there to get a case up to the Supreme Court. Entered a woman named Carrie Buck, born in Charlottesville, Virginia, to a poor family that was forced to place her into foster care. In 1924, she was raped and got pregnant, and her foster parents had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. A short time later, Carrie gave birth to a daughter named Vivian. Now the colony believed that Carrie, her mother Emma, who was also at the same facility, and her newborn daughter Vivian were all feeble-minded, so they wanted to sterilize Carrie. This became the test case for the constitutionality of the eugenical sterilization laws. Prior to the case, the prosecutors contacted the ERO, our friends 30 miles from here, and they asked for their help. Now, Harry Laughlin couldn't attend, but he helped them by preparing written testimony. He never met Carrie or Emma, but he sworn under oath that they were both feeble-minded. And he sent Arthur Estabrook, a researcher from the ERO, to testify as an expert witness. He never met Vivian Buck, who was only 8 months at the time, but he testified in court that Vivian also was feeble-minded. Laughlin also helped in drafting the appeals and information in later cases. On November of 1924, Carrie's first trial began. Irving Whitehead, who's her court-appointed lawyer, now I'm a lawyer. If I did any of this or all of this, I would or should be disbarred. These are the things he did and didn't do. He failed to object or challenge to any evidence being submitted against her client. His questions actually assisted in the case against her, his own client, and he had a relationship with the state's attorneys without disclosing it. And it was later realized that it was all part of the ruse. He was part of this, very connected with the prosecution side. She was ambushed from the beginning. So in February 1925, the lower court ruled yes, Carrie Buck could be sterilized, but that wasn't the goal. They wanted to go up to appeal and then go up to the Supreme Court. On appeal, it was also upheld. But when it goes up to an appeal, all the evidence submitted counts as fact. The Supreme Court's not going to change or challenge anything. They just assume and believe that's fact. So it's only a matter of law now, a question of law, that they're there to decide. Is it cruel and unusual punishment? Does it violate the Constitution? So in the spring of 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court finally heard the case. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Virginia could sterilize Carrie Buck against her will based on eugenics. This decision has never been reversed. This man here, fancy handlebars mustache, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he wrote the court's decision, 5 paragraphs in length. And part of what he wrote is this: "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for their crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Yes?
Which justice wrote the dissent?
The lone dissenting judge was the Catholic judge on the bench, who was against eugenics. But obviously 8-1, it really had no play in it. Now, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Think about that, right? Now, this is a very interesting point. One is, Carrie, when she was brought to the colony, they declared her a middle grade moron. Remember we talked about the categories, they're very specific. She wasn't an imbecile. And perhaps you can quibble over what's the difference, but there was a legitimate difference. It didn't matter to the court. But also, 3 generations of imbeciles. Remember the slide I showed you before with Yapang, 4 generations in one almshouse at one time? Remember the 3 women and 1 holding a 2-week-old baby? That language came from from the ERO, 30 miles from here, from Harry Laughlin, and it influenced the Supreme Court into this decision. There's no mistake and no accident why this language was there. On October 19, 1927, Carrie Buck was sterilized. She was 21 years old. A few years later, her daughter Vivian tragically died of an intestinal infection following the measles. Now, prior to Buck v. Bell, there were just over 3,000 sterilizations. Afterwards, through the 30s and the 1960s, there were more than 60,000 eugenical sterilizations, largely led in California, North Carolina, and Virginia. And let me be clear, and I should have said this earlier, when I say eugenical sterilizations, these are by force. You have no choice. You were brought in, man and woman, mostly women, and you're going to get sterilized. And if you resist it, they'll strap you down, they'll sedate you, you're going to get sterilized. That's what this means. It's not like a choice. It's compulsory. On tribal lands, between 25% and 50% of Native American women were sterilized. In Puerto Rico, up to 20,000 women in one town alone were sterilized, and by 1965, 1/3 of the women on the island between the ages of 25 and 49 were sterilized. Buck v. Bell opened up the case. Yes?
Who was doing that?
These policies, it all stuck, it all flowed from the eugenics. I'll get to the point, because eugenics kind of goes underground, but the policies didn't. The idea of let's sterilize those who were not, who should not have children, continued. like the title says, right? November of 1915, a woman gave birth in a Chicago hospital to a child with a deformity and extreme abnormalities. The chief surgeon, Dr. Harry Hazelton, was summoned. He saw the child, refused to treat the child, let the child die. He was cleared of wrongdoing by a medical panel, and then he and his cohorts went on a six-state tour celebrating this decision to promote eugenics. His story was partly inspired in the movie The Black Storm. Now, at the Illinois Institution for the Feeble-Minded, at that facility, windows are purposely kept open and without screens. So in the winter, drafts are coming in the summer, swarming in parasitic insects coming in. Patients there were reportedly given milk from cows that were infected with tuberculosis. The death rate at this facility was as high as 30%, largely from tuberculosis. The man on your right, U.S. Judge Harry Olson, he condemned many patients to this facility. He was a known eugenicist. He was the president of the Eugenics Record Office, and he helped publish Harry Laughlin's book, Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. I would posit to you that this was murder in the name of eugenics on U.S. soil. Now, we talked a lot about local and national, but the ERO, the global reach was amazing. Around the globe, many countries adopted the same policies. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, England, Finland, France, Italy, Norway, Romania, Sweden, and Switzerland all had eugenical policies and eugenical sterilizations in mass. In 1929, Charles Davenport led a delegation to Rome, the oldest capital of the world, they called it. Every country was represented to talk about them, and the goal there was to create a world map, an atlas. And they wanted to identify where these so-called defectives are in each country to make a list. They were playing God. They were looking to put this list together and eliminate these people around the globe. Now, in the U.S., even with Buck v. Bell, the U.S. generally had some guardrails, the Constitution, but in Nazi Germany, as you would imagine, there was no such restraint. Germany's eugenic program was directly inspired by the American program. Most people have that completely opposite. Hitler himself was avid about eugenics, although he once told someone that if his mother was given one of those eugenic questionnaires, he's pretty sure he would not have been born, meaning his mother would have been sterilized. Even he understood the intricacies and fallacies of it. The American and German eugenic programs are closely aligned. In Germany, the German program was led by a man named Otto von Verscher. He was the director of the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Race Hygiene in Frankfurt, Germany. In 1934, Verscher's work was cited by the American Medical Association. He was lauded across the world, and particularly in America, for his work, and he was directly connected with Charles Davenport and the ERO. He joined the advisory board of Eugenical News, that publication part. And Davenport arranged for a delegation of Nazi eugenicists to attend Harvard's 300th anniversary in 1936. Now, Verscher, like Davenport, was eager to expand his work on eugenics. In 1934, a sterilization statute was passed in Germany where 56,000 Germans were sterilized from a law that targeted as many as 400,000 citizens. In 1935, he hired a young assistant to carry out research on behalf of the Institute. The name of that man on the right is Joseph Mengele, the angel of death. In 1943, Verscher sent Mengele to Auschwitz, and some of his acts included: he sewed the wrists and backs of twin boys to simulate Siamese twins. He killed people and performed autopsies to, quote, while the bodies were still warm. He removed the patient's stomach without anesthesia. He dissected body parts and sent them back to Verscher for further study marked urgent national defense. And he injected dye into the eyes of children, usually twins, usually leaving them blind. Now, in the summer of 1936, the Heidelberg University School of Medicine in Germany was having its 550th anniversary. It's a big gala event around the world. Carl Schneider was the dean of the school at the time. He awarded Harry Laughlin from the ERO and with an honorary degree for his work on eugenics. He called Laughlin one of the most important pioneers in the field of racial hygiene. See the postage stamp on the far right? The swastika. See the address here, Cold Spring Harbor. One of the clear, most chilling links between, and to show the connections that these groups had with such heinous activity outside. Just 3 years after this was awarded, Karl Schneider, the dean of the school, served as the lead researcher to organize the Nazi T4 program. They used carbon monoxide in various centers throughout Germany to lethally gas 70,000 German men, women, and children who were disabled or defective citizens based on eugenics. Notice I said German citizens. This is pre-Holocaust. They went after their own based on eugenics, exactly, well before the war. The victims, and this will sound familiar, the victims were herded into large gas chambers disguised as showers. And then they went as far as to have ashes and fake birth certificates sent to the loved ones of those that they had just killed, kind of put on the show. This event was often called the first Nazi genocide and served as a template for the Holocaust, and it all has ties to eugenics. After the war, November 1946, the doctor's trial in Nuremberg took place. There were several trials in Nuremberg. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal doctor, and 22 other Nazi doctors stood trial for crimes against humanity. And I read you some bad stuff. I assure you it was worse. Really, really brutal stuff. In their defense, they said that they were directly inspired by the American eugenics program. Think about this. They argued that in America, the Supreme Court of the United States in Buck v. Bell allowed the state to sterilize a woman against her will. They cited Laughlin's report calling for mass sterilization and mass murder by as early as 1914, before the Nazi Party was even a Nazi party. So their argument was, what did we do so different? Brandt and 6 others were convicted and hanged for their crimes. Both Mengele and Verscher never faced justice. What was it all for? Well, the Carnegie Institute, which funded a program for decades, could not ignore the ongoing atrocities. In January of 1939, the Institute sent a committee to review the millions of records stored at the ERO. And they determined that the records were sloppily recorded by untrained persons and were rendered, quote, worthless for genetic study. Eugenics was deemed as speculative and not a true science. The ERO was closed later that year on December 1st, and all references to eugenics were permanently changed to genetics.
Where is this?
The ERO, that's the Carnegie Institute sent a committee to the ERO over here in Cold Spring Harbor to review all the records, and that's when they realized this was all just speculative at best. Now, Davenport himself had retired in 1934, but he stayed on as sort of his luminary and was always busy. He died in February 18, 1944 from a bronchial infection while conducting research on the skull of a whale that washed ashore on Long Island. We were talking about that before, Liza, about the whaling museum. That skull was going to be the founding the piece for the basis of that museum, which is now standing today. Harry Laughlin himself, he died January 26, 1943 at 63 years old in Kirkland, Missouri. Among the many things he did, which were a lot in the name of eugenics, he specialized in rooting out epilepsy. That was his thing, epilepsy. It was later discovered that he himself was an epileptic. The fact that he had long kept the secret. A reckoning. In summer of 2020, Eric Isaacs, the president of the Carnegie Institute, issued the following statement. There is no excuse then or now for our institution's previous willingness to empower researchers who sought to pervert scientific inquiry to justify their own racist and ableist prejudices. Our support of eugenics made us complicit in driving decades of brutal and unconscionable actions by governments in the United States and around the world. As the president of the Carnegie Institute for Science, I want to express my sincere and profound apologies for this organization's past involvement in these horrific pseudoscientific activities. That apology dropped on the website 2020 overnight, no public statement after that. California, North Carolina, and Virginia later passed reparations bills to help pay victims who have been sterilized, but many of them have already passed too little too late. What are the legacies of eugenics today? Well, in 2002, the Netherlands became the first country to allow doctors to euthanize patients with incurable illnesses. To date, nearly 60,000 people have been euthanized. Canada has one. Even some U.S. states have these kind of laws that allow this, but under extreme circumstances. 2022 report shows that there are 31 states in the U.S. that still allow for forced sterilization of people with disabilities, including California, Florida, New York, and D.C. U.S. prison systems have been offering reduced sentencing if inmates agree to be sterilized. And in 2023, the FDA began to review new technology that can produce artificial wombs for human beings. Some international companies have developed artificial growth pods that simulate a womb, which can be monitored from your smartphone. Now, I make no judgment on the need or legitimacy of this technology, but knowing the history as I know it, there certainly is a lot of cause for concern. Eugenics had all the trappings of a science. It looked like a science, but in reality, it was nothing more than a social philosophy driven by racist and classist ideals, which we use to brand, condemn, and eliminate the poor, diseased, disabled, and less fortunate from society. No one's perfect. We all bring differences, and that's what makes us special. But eugenicists can never accept that premise. Again, the book, Long Island, The Legacy of Eugenics. I'm here for any questions you may have.
Yes. It's quite eye-opening, number one.
Yes.
And there was something back in the beginning of your presentation that said, in the U.S. And was there some study or movement that the U.S., because it was a nation of different, because it doesn't seem right. We're a nation of immigrants, as they say. So.
Well, the thing about eugenics was it was sold as a science, right? Now, for all the years before, they studied the skulls and the body size. They wanted to understand more about the blood, right? What makes us us? This is pre-DNA. They didn't crack the gene code until the 60s, so they were way off, right? But they were trying. In legitimacy, they thought they had an answer here. But then it became co-opted with these anti-immigration forces and all these other forces that kind of, either they meshed or they ran in parallel tandem. But they each had the same goal. Let's get rid of those who are dragging us down, right? The good ones down. And what's most astonishing about this is two reasons, what I always said. This was not a small movement. The whole country bought it in, the whole world bought it on this, one. And two, we led this way. This was made here, not in Nazi Germany, not in these other places. It was made here, perfected here as a practice, and it inspired those other places to do all of that stuff. So it really was an American-made science, but it really was a philosophy, right? And that philosophy is, how do you kill a social philosophy? If people are driven by hate and bigotry, they're gonna, it's really hard to change that. You hope they could change. But when they have a position to influence a lot of people, or a country, or the world, that's when the real danger happens. And that's really what happened here. Yes?
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. What evidence do you see of eugenics in today's popular culture?
There's a lot of slippery slopes. The things I mentioned at the end. Now, take parents, right? They maybe an elderly parent, elderly couple that are about to have a child. They go for this test, the amniocentesis. They want to determine if that child is going to be healthy or not. And I make no judgments on that because it's legitimate. Are doctors more inclined to, if there is an abnormality detected, to steer you towards, do you want to abort the child? It's not coercion like it was here. It's not, you have no choice. But is it framed in, an extremely emotional, volatile circumstance? Is it more geared towards they're going to urge you, nudge you towards that? I'm more worried about the popular comments and statements made. And I'll give you a few examples. So recently, RFK was talking about making a list of autistics throughout the country. Now, that frightens me for many reasons. One is trying to get around the HIPAA laws, right? Because if I have a child, I don't want you to know. My doctors know, but that's my right to consent or not. They want to get around that. Back in this era, they wanted to do the same thing with blind people. They wanted to make a list of all the blind people in New York first and throughout the country. And the people who held back were the census records for one, and others, and it never really took footing. Now, if they did get that records, what would have happened? They likely would have targeted them. They would have tried to marginalize them and hoped to sterilize them. The other comment that worries me is when I hear ideas of, giving more money to have more children. You've heard that in the news? The Nazis did, that was called the Lebensborn Project in Nazi Germany. Himmler himself was illegitimate father of at least 2 children under the same program. The irony of that is they're basically paying a mother to have a child and then walk away. That's the kind of immorality that eugenicists railed against. Like, we don't like this, but yet it's okay if it's the right people doing it. The hypocrisies are there. So I guess what worries me is gone are the days of a science anymore, right? There's no eugenics that's going to legitimize this. But what worries me is it even needed anymore? Is the fervor so high that we're just going to take the social philosophy and try to do it anyway? And those are the things I worry about in modern times of that. You know, just the general, there's a lot of technology which I support. There's a lot of laws to protect some of that technology. You can't discriminate based on genealogy and some of these new laws that are good because, you know, people shouldn't be treated differently for that. But we always can fall in danger of lapsing into those. You know, some of those things I talked about, you know, if someone's incurably, if they're in agonizing pain, no hope of and they're sound mind, and the doctor supports it, the family supports it, and they follow everything to the T and have a right to be euthanized, to be killed. Yeah. That to me should be a very rare circumstance to meet all those criteria. What worries me is, what if those criteria get weaker, lessened, where it's a little easier to get? In Canada, there's a child with autism that wants to be killed under the euthanasia statute. The parents are fighting it. So wait a minute, you know, it doesn't fit the criteria, and the courts are considering it, which is frightening because...
This is true right now?
Yeah, this is actually true right now. Okay. And the concern is the child even of sound mind to make that decision because that person has autism? I don't know. But does it fit the criteria, the agonizing pain, the no hope of recovery? Can this person live with autism like many do? It's just a lot of questions on that. So the fear is that with these guardrails get weaker and weaker, and it could kind of revert back to this. Maybe not fully what it was, but anything close to it is scary enough. Yes?
What did Robert Kennedy say?
Kennedy said he wanted to have, they wanted to make a list. They're proposing making a list of people throughout the country. But not a public list. They wanted to get the data of all the people with autism.
They, meaning Robert Kennedy, wants the list.
The Department of Health.
Department of Health, through the Department of Health. But they made the public statements, which is even troubling. But the idea is, through HIPAA, you can't and shouldn't get that unless I want to give it. If I say yeah, you know, and their argument they made, and I'm not going to say it's not legitimate because I can understand it to a point, that they can't do enough studies on autism because not a lot of people are signing up for the test, which is legitimate because how can they learn more if they don't? But at the same time, you shouldn't get around the law that's there to protect people to fix that. There should be better ways to open that up and have more people volunteer.
My second question was, didn't the whole eugenics thing become a very black-white thing?
Well, you know, yeah, it was, but it was as much class as it was race. And I'll tell you, in these records, they, you know, especially upstate, Ulster County, you know, people living up there, hard lives, and they would say, you know, let's go hunt the shiftless whites of the South, or the white degenerates in upstate New York. So for them, it didn't matter as much if you were black, white, if you were under the cut, what they deemed you were to be. That's what really mattered to them. So they were, it was as much racist as it was classist.
And did they have a specific amount of people who were at the helm?
The helm of the whole operation?
Yeah.
You know, ironically, at the ERO, it wasn't a large group. I mean, they had these field agents. Most of them were college students who went out to get these data. Davenport, Laughlin, they had some people. But throughout the country, it opened up. You mentioned the West Coast before. Paul Popenoe was a renowned eugenicist and
what was his name?
Paul Popenoe. He was a real big-time eugenicist, and that probably led to the majority of sterilizations out west. Other states, you know, had these Virginia, of course, North Carolina, and this was even after the eugenics. See, at the end of the war and the ERO closed, eugenics as an organization went underground.
First or Second World War?
Second World War. It kind of went underground because of everything was going on. They couldn't ignore it, but the sentiment never really went away. So the sterilizations picked up after the war through the 50s, 60s, 70s in Southern California. They were sterilizing.
Picked up.
Sorry.
They increased.
They increased. Yeah. And it wasn't as eugenics anymore. It was they'll give you a consent form to sign, but you only speak Spanish, or you know you were tricked and told. Women in Puerto Rico were told it's just a cleaning. It's reversible. You know, there was one woman from Southern California. She was a Chicana. She lived in this community. And she was brought in for testing, and she was never told, but she was sterilized. She comes out. She didn't know she's sterilized. She goes home, and her and her husband are trying to have a baby. They can't have a baby. So the husband starts getting mad, thinking he thought she was cheating on her, and she's using birth control to stop. He was getting drunk. He was getting violent. It got so bad that she committed suicide. She didn't know she was sterilized. You know, and so it was going on well past the eugenics as an organization, went underground, but the sentiment went on.
And these sterilizations were not voluntary.
Initially, no. Later, they were either by trickery or deception. I'll give you an example. In California specifically, the medical board, you had to have 2 forms of consent, 2 forms separately. So you could do one and then later do another. It's like a layer of protections. They eventually weakened that to make it just one. And again, some of them were in English, not Spanish. No interpreters, no. And people were just either scared or confused. You know, some people were starting to get sedated, and they're telling, oh yeah, sign this. As you're about to go under, they're telling you to sign a consent form. And meanwhile, you're in pain, or you know, if there was a painful condition, and of course you're going to do it to get the painkillers and sedatives. And there's a lot of examples of that too, where it was through coercion, deception. You know, so not the original way it was, where you strap down and you have no choice. Even though states still have it, and Buck v. Bell, you know, made it legal. It still is legal. Although, based on eugenics, the likelihood that'll ever happen again is pretty much.
The very, very high numbers in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, what was that one?
How did they get the women in wherever they went, you know, to do that? It was a ridiculous.
There was a lot of those. That was during the pharmaceutical era, right? Viagra, they used to make the pills down there. A lot of women were tricked, deceived. You know, there was a man, you know, Cornelius Rhodes. He was a doctor. He helped found Sloan Kettering, right? Renowned scientist. He did a lot of treatment in Puerto Rico. So he had a few drinks one night, and he writes a letter that became public. And he said that he had killed 8 people by injecting them with poison. We don't know what that is. And that he wanted to just get rid of everyone on the island, like vermin and all this stuff. That letter was taken and shared at the UN, all around the world. The US was a huge scandal. And he said, well, I was just drinking, and I didn't mean it.
Oh.
And he got off the hook, later became a celebrated person at Sloan Kettering. That was the sentiment of a leading doctor at the time. This was...
Not too long
No,
ago.
not too long, 50s, 60s, 70s. So, you know, if the sentiment is there, and you know, you're supposed to provide care for people, that's the danger, yes.
Is there any nation in the world today where eugenics is above ground, that is considered to be legitimate?
No, again, the science, the name itself kind of went underground, and it gave way to genetics, right? We know so much more now, and we know how wrong it was then.
Well, I guess I meant also the sentiments.
Well, you could argue. Well, you could argue here if enough people talk about it. It's a great question because in Europe at the time, right? Think about what we were facing here in the 20s. High immigration, people getting really mad. Much like now, there's a lot of anti-immigration fervor, and that's one thing. Over in Europe, they didn't have that problem. So their beliefs were more purely eugenical. They believed, hey, you know, these people are bad genes. We shouldn't let them procreate. So they have more sincere beliefs of that. But again, the idea of these statutes, and certainly under the name of eugenics, don't exist. But am I to suggest that the social philosophy's gone? No. It may not be as open in some places as others, but I think you can always revert to that.
My thoughts are like, you know, Cambodia with Pol Pot and stuff like that. Have you feeble-minded enough that you needed glasses?
Yeah.
That was enough to get you killed because you were
It was
intellectual. I mean, that was incentive.
You know, they thought it was like putting down deformed an animal, like a pet that's really hurt. You know, when you put them to sleep.
Oh,
Sometimes they believe.
They at the top.
Yes, that's right. The irony, and that's the whole point, right? If you're on the safe side of this, like how can Helen Keller support it? How can W.E.B. Du Bois, a black man, intellectual as he was seen as the black man that they sought him to be. But again, my belief is, sadly, humanity has a way of rationalizing. As long as you're on the safe side, you can turn your back on your culture, your race, whatever stature it is, as long as you and your family is safe. And that's a sad indictment on us, but it's just an unfortunate fact. And people felt safe, even Hitler. He understood, wait a minute, my mother, for him to say that, right? Now, think about this. Now, he's the leader of the perfect race, right? And have all these images of him. He understood that his mother would have been sterilized based on the questions. So what did that say of him? But yet, he's on this side, and then I'm just going to do everything else. And the thing about the Nazis was they didn't need much, right? They were going to do what they were going to do, and you read Mein Kampf and know what he wanted to do. This gave them a sense of legitimacy, a cloak of science, to say, well, of course we're doing it. When you thought about it over there, we're going to do it here too. Of course, they even went on steroids above and beyond that, But even at the early levels, 56,000 sterilizations in 1 year. I mean, they target half a million people in their own nation.
You know the story with the triplets, the triplet boys on Long Island that was
Yeah.
separated? Now, was that, I mean, did you know the story?
I'm not sure if I remember that one.
Oh, there's a movie about it. It's 3 boys who were identical triplets.
And they were
They're identical.
fused together, yeah.
No, no, no.
No,
Oh.
They
no.
were born and they were put up for adoption by their parents.
Yes, and under the guise that they were being watched to see if they grew up the same, depending, it was called, you know,
When was this around?
Oh,
now,
now,
they're
yeah.
alive.
Oh.
I actually went to school with the father of one of these kids, and it was a horror story. Well, it started off, it was upstate New York, and
Yeah.
one of the colleges upstate.
Yes.
And some kid saw another kid and said, hey, you know, how you doing? He goes, I'm not who you think I am. I go, oh, yes, you are.
And
You
they
know,
had
look
the same
exactly like 'em.
birthdays and
Wow.
everything.
Yeah, and
You know-
then they got it together, it was like the headlines of the Daily News, who separated twins or something,
Yeah.
and the next thing you know, the third kid says, there's 3 of us.
Yeah, you know, and the Nazis loved twins, right? But for a long time, I had to figure out really what was the reason. The answer is simple, actually. If you want to make a perfect race and you get twins, you do it twice as fast. So they believe that now, but before the Nazis, Davenport himself studied twins. They studied the eye colors. They were fascinated by twins. Like, what is this? You know, just in general, right? Twins is a pretty remarkable thing, I suppose, for humanity. Twins, triplets. I have sister-in-laws that are twins, and it's just an amazing thing. But for them, they were like marveled at the possibilities of what this could be.